Hello there.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm doing wonderfully. How about yourself?
Good. How's the volume on your end?
Volume sounds pretty good, at least from what I can see in the levels.
Okay, great.
Fantastic. Did you want to appear on video, or would you prefer to just go audio?
Let's just go audio if that's okay with you.
Yeah, works fine for me. Would you like to introduce yourself, or shall I list off your many and significant accomplishments?
Oh, stop! You're making me blush. I can certainly give you a very brief overview of who I am and what I stand for. Absolutely. Let me know when you want me to do that.
Oh yeah, no. Please go right ahead, and then we'll get started.
Okay. Well, hello. My name is Phil Gurski. I'm Canadian. I spent 32 years in Canadian security intelligence, both on the signals intelligence side and on the human side. So working both for CSE, or Communications Security Establishment, Canada's Signals Intelligence Organization, as well as the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. And the latter half of my career was focused on terrorism, i.e. counterterrorism. I retired from the Canadian government in April of 2015. And since that time, I've written 5 books on terrorism, focusing pretty well, not exclusively, but mostly on Islamist extremism, i.e. jihadis, and have been anything but retired, been almost as busy as I was when I worked in intelligence as I am right now.
Yeah, very much not in retirement then. Yeah, so I saw an interview that you had a while back with a Twitch streamer named Destiny, and
Yes.
You're right. I was curious in I guess further exploring a couple of the subjects that were discussed back then. So one thing that I feel is often the case when it comes to online discussion amongst left-leaning people is that oh, hold on one second. There's an echo on your end. Do you have any earbuds or a headset?
I am wearing a headset.
Oh, interesting. How is it is the sound being broadcast out loud?
Hang on. Go ahead. It should be.
Hello?
No, it's only through the headsets.
Oh, interesting. Okay, it seems to have fixed. Well, whatever the case may be, very often when lefties are talking about, I guess, foreign relations or talking about geopolitical power, we discuss them from a very particular angle or from a very specific frame of reference. So I guess just to get things started and to get your perspective on a very, very immediately important subject, what is your opinion broadly on the handling of the Syrian region by Trump, his decision to remove American troops from that area and sort of leave it to the Kurds and to the Turkish fighters?
Okay, that's a great question, and it's one that I've given a great deal of thought to. My second book was actually a book on what's called the foreign fighter phenomenon, i.e. Canadians, Americans, Europeans, whatever, who elected to go fight with ISIS or other terrorist groups in the region from 2013-ish to 2017-ish. Mm-hmm. And it's a huge conundrum for us because these people were clearly terrorists. We should not have let them leave in the first place, but for whatever reason we didn't know about them or turned a blind eye. They joined terrorist groups. They did heinous acts of violence against people such as the Yazidis, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Some of them are dead. Some of them are still active. Some are sitting in camps, either run by the Kurds or the Turks or the Syrians. And we're wondering, what do we do with them? Do we let them leave them up to their own fate? Do we let the Iraqis and Syrians try them, which will probably lead to their execution, given that the laws are like that over there? Do we repatriate them? Do we try them here? Problems with evidence gathering, et cetera, et cetera. Do we try to rehabilitate them? This is an ongoing argument, and most Western countries have chosen to wash their hands of their citizens. And some countries have actually removed citizenship, i.e. we don't want you back. That to me is not a very good argument. And again, I argued why in my book on Western foreign fighters. But see, the larger question you ask is interesting because in a case like this, and bear in mind, I'm answering as a Canadian. I'm not an American. We didn't join the war in Iraq 2003. We elected not to, and in hindsight, it was a good decision on our part. The problem is that when it comes to these issues, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. And let me explain. One of the leading causes, one of the leading drivers of terrorism around the world, mostly to do with Islamist extremists, which is my specialty, is they're very angry at our, and by our I mean Western writ large, our interference in their affairs. So American invasion of Iraq 2003, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan 1979, Ethiopians in Somalia 2005. The list goes on and on and on. So the mere fact that we're there is basically a casus belli. It's a cause of war for them to want to strike us, carry out terrorist attacks, to get us to leave. They don't want us there. The problem is, if we up and leave, if we pull up stakes and get out, which we by the way have done in Afghanistan. Canada left in Afghanistan in 2014 for all intents and purposes. The Trump administration has pulled back in Afghanistan, it's pulled back in Iraq, it's pulled back in a whole bunch of places. The problem is that the situation is so bad on the ground that the vacuum created by the withdrawal of a significant number of qualified forces, and let's face it, the Americans are the best army in the world, doesn't help matters. So if you stay, you create a problem. If you go, you create a problem. So what's the ideal solution? And I think the answer to that is we don't know. If we could undo this, if we could go back in time, re-roll the dice, we wouldn't have gone in the first place. And everyone knows that the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was predicated on partly faulty intelligence, and I'm a little sensitive here because I worked in intelligence at the time, more shall we say, a willful blindness to what intelligence was or was not saying at the time. We simply didn't have the information that was as certain as Colin Powell and the Bush administration made it out to be 17 years ago. If we could go undo things, we wouldn't have invaded in the first place. If we had not invaded in the first place, Al-Qaeda would not have morphed into Al-Qaeda in Iraq and then ISIS. You wouldn't have had the creation of other groups in the region. But, this is real life. This isn't some kind of Hollywood film. We can't do a Jimmy Stewart and roll back the clock. Life doesn't work that way. And so this is a very long answer to your very short question. I apologize.
No, not at all. I appreciate it.
The problem is that I don't think there's an answer to this issue. So the longer we stay, the more we're hated, the more we become targets, the more we give terrorist groups the justification for doing what we're doing. And yet, if we were to withdraw precipitously, those groups would probably gain in strength because the local armies are simply not up to snuff. They don't have the material, they don't have the manpower, they don't have the expertise, et cetera, et cetera. So if the U.S., for example, were to pull out holus bolus from Iraq, like overnight, there's a very real chance that Islamic State would reconstitute the caliphate, which, of course, we all know what they did when they held territory in Iraq for the 5-year period. And so I just don't think there is any ideal solution to this. I understand the political pressures. I understand what it's like to have your own citizens killed while serving in armies abroad, in wars that most Americans or Canadians say, what are we there for? And why are we there? What's the interest for the United States or Canada to be in country X, Y, or Z? And yet, if we pull out, we make things worse. So it's a conundrum without a solution. And I wish I had an easy answer for you, but I don't. And I think I'm pretty sure that no one else does either.
Do you believe? Sorry, 1 second. Do you believe it is a good idea, or do you believe it would be a good idea for us to give reparations to some of these countries that have been affected by Western imperialism in an attempt to bring them to a point of stabilization where they can reasonably deal with these threats themselves? Do you feel that would be a viable solution, or do you think that would be just pouring money on the problem without any real expectation of it getting better?
You're asking me all these hard questions today.
Sorry.
The problem with reparations is that, how far back do you go? Let me just give you an example that has nothing to do with our conversation, but may help illustrate the difficulty. So we here in Canada, of course, had an atrocious history with what we call our First Nations, you call Native Americans, over many decades, dating back to the 19th century. And we've been trying to right that wrong for the better part of 40 or 50 years, recognizing residential schools, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, land stealing, et cetera, et cetera. So we've done what we can, but the hands keep coming out. And it's like, okay, you've given us this amount of money, and I believe it's been in the hundreds of millions of dollars. It's not enough. We need more, we need more, we need more. So where does the asking stop? That's the first problem. Secondly is I'm not sure that throwing money at the problem is a viable solution because A, who's going to receive the money? B, how is the money going to be used? you know, you hear these stories in Afghanistan and Iraq and any other war where, you know, the local power, be it the indigenous power or foreign power, arrives with bags of money and says, here, just take this and do this for me. And most of it is misused. It's corrupted. It goes to all kinds of people, nothing to do with the problem itself. So you don't know that the money is going to be spent in the proper fashion. However, if there is a silver lining to any of this, and I'm not sure that there is, equipping, financing, enabling local forces is a damn sight better than sticking around indefinitely, because you begin to ask yourself the question, what is our exit strategy? And it's interesting that we're having this conversation because I've done a couple of podcasts, or sorry, a couple of blogs in the last few days. I do a daily blog called Today in Terrorism, where I look at an incident in the past and discuss what its relationship is to today. And the last week alone, I've done two blogs that both have to do with the Vietnam War, terrorist attacks that came out of the Vietnam War. And of course, that war went on for the better part of 15 years from an American perspective, and how many years from a French perspective before that. And you get in so deep that you almost can't see any light at the end of the tunnel. And so if you cut bait and leave in a heartbeat, you don't resolve things. If you stay indefinitely, you don't resolve things. If you try to enable local partners, you have to ensure the local partners are A, capable, B, on your side, not the other side, and C, aren't as corrupt as hell. We're going to take these oodles of cash and use it for purposes that have nothing to do with trying to resolve differences, create a stable environment, right historical wrongs, and create a society that is basically a self-functioning society.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, actually, how much this question is reflective of a question we have here in the United States, which is, what do we do with the historical socioeconomic disadvantage that Black people in our country have experienced? We know in our country that Black people are, for example, more prone to criminality due to a wide variety of sort of, surrounding conditions. And the question is, and we talk about this almost in the same way that we do about countries that have suffered extensive foreign interference, do we just throw money at the problem, or do we recognize there are deep underlying issues, infrastructural issues that need to be addressed before it's even possible for us to, bring these groups up to par? I think, especially in the case with the Middle East, we've seen the consequences of America acting as the world's police. We've seen the animosity that it's driven, and I think in a way it's analogous almost to the over-policing of some communities in this country. And in both instances, I think, or at least I imagine you would agree, as you just said, that allowing these countries to deal with these problems on their own, with the tools necessary to deal with these problems on their own, is probably the best long-term solution.
It is. You have to accept that there'll be further disorder rather than order in the intermediate period. These countries are not going to have the ability to wave a magic wand and make things better overnight. I'm glad you raised Black Lives Matter, because obviously this is an issue in a lot of countries, including my own. It doesn't exist here to, I would argue, a lesser extent. Some people would criticize me for saying that, but I don't think we have near the same problem that you do, for the historical reasons we both know. But again, going back to my earlier point, how far back do you go to address grievances? Do you go back to the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s? Do you go back to the end of slavery in the 19th century? Do you go back to the original use of the societal tool of slavery in the 17th century? See, these problems, and I think most problems in life are severely complicated. And what worries me are people who don't acknowledge that and think, well, this is an easy solution. We'll just do this and it'll resolve our problem. Well, it doesn't. And as someone who's looked at terrorism as long as I have, terrorism is very, very, very complicated. And I think that people coming up with, off the top of their head solutions saying that this is going to resolve 90% or whatever of the issue we have, they're smoking something. Because life doesn't work that way.
True.
And I just wish that we would acknowledge that these issues, and they are intractable issues, they are longstanding issues, require a lot of very bright people who have good intentions. They don't have vested interests necessarily, who will admit that there's things they don't know, who will admit that they don't have the answers to everything, and are willing to collaborate to find the best way forward, because it's complicated as much of life is. And that's what worries me, is that we ignore that fact.
Are you at all concerned with the preponderance of Islamic terrorism or jihadism in what we generally refer to as the West, with or with terrorist cells developing in Europe, America, places like that?
I am. Okay, so obviously I have a biased perspective because I worked on Islamist extremism for 15 years with the security service. I've written, as I said, I've written 5 books on the matter. I've worked on hundreds and hundreds of cases. I've talked to counterterrorism officials in over 70 countries around the world. When I worked as an intelligence analyst, I would like to feel I'm well versed in the subject of Islamist extremism. I don't use the term expert, by the way, because to me, experts are meaningless. Everyone's an expert. You turn on CNN, you turn on CBC, whatever. So-and-so is an expert. They can't spell terrorism, but they're an expert. So I don't use the term for myself. So I do have a jaundiced view because that's what I did. However, I think if you look at numbers, and there's been excellent reports put out by an institution out of Australia, and it's they write what's called the Global Terrorism Index. It's the Institute for Economics and Peace, I believe it's called, out of Australia. And every year they put out a global terrorism index, meaning what happened the year before. And they'll look at trends, they'll look at what's changing, what's not changing. The most recent reports for 2019, and they found, and you can look it up, it's Global Terrorism Index, more than 80% of all terrorist deaths around the world were carried out, or were occurred in attacks carried out by Islamist extremists, i.e. ISIS, i.e. Al-Qaeda, i.e. Al-Shabaab, i.e. Boko Haram, i.e. pick any one of 1,000 different terrorist groups. So to my mind, if you look at it globally, there's no question that Islamist extremism is by far the greatest terrorist threat we face. There's other threats we face, but the greatest terrorist threat is Islamist extremism. Now, in the Western world, I would also argue that in most countries, with the possible exception of yours, Islamist extremism is still the #1 threat. You're still seeing arrests in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in France, in Spain, here in Canada, of individuals who buy into this jihadi mentality. What's complicating things is that there are other types of terrorist threats that, I don't like the term rising because they've always been there, but are attracting a little more attention. And of course, in your country, we're talking about the far right, white supremacists, white nationalists, Boogaloo boys, the 3%ers. I mean, there's a whole shitload of groups that are, right of the spectrum, neo-Nazis, et cetera, et cetera. We have them here in Canada as well. They're a problem, and they're a problem for the FBI, and they're a problem for local police forces. So they have to be looked at. I would still argue that worldwide, they do not pose nearly the same threat as Islamists, but they cannot be ignored. Here's a third thing we have to worry about, one we haven't had to worry about for quite some time now. There is a movement, there's a phenomenon, movement's not the right word, that one would call sort of leftist terrorism, be that eco-terrorism, be it anarchist terrorism like the Black Bloc, for example, which is also out there. And again, I'm not overemphasizing how dangerous these wankers are. They're not for the most part, but there are violent elements within those particular organizations. What this means is that your security intelligence agencies and your law enforcement agencies are forced to look at multiple threats simultaneously. And why this is challenging is that, let's face it, for the past 20 years, almost, since 9/11, what's been our unerring focus? Jihadis. Why? Because 3,000 people were killed on 9/11. And because there are other attacks like the Orlando attack and the attack in San Bernardino. There are attacks in my country. There are attacks in Western Europe. And so your what I call your protectors, the people that are paid to stop these things, have to find the resource to look at the jihadis, which is still #1, and the far right, which is a very broad term that covers a lot of things, and increasingly what I'm calling the far left, although it's a lousy term to define what I'm talking about. And then you may throw in the violent incels, which I don't think are terrorists. I think it's hateful misogyny, personally. Some call it terrorism, I don't. And therefore, these agencies have to do all of these things simultaneously. And what happened after 9/11 is all of us made out like bandits. We all got more money. We all got more resources. We got just a ton of stuff to do our jobs better. Those days are over, especially in a COVID-19 period where your government and my government, every government in the world is now trillions of dollars in debt because of the COVID effect on our economy. These security services are not getting more resources tomorrow. So they have to do more with less or more with the same resources. And that's the challenge that they face.
Gotcha. Uh, a couple of points there. I guess I'll go one at a time. How do you feel about the assertion that while Islamic extremism is undeniably the most prominent terroristic force in the world today, that's in large part because the forms of terrorism we commit are state terrorism. That when you have a person like George Bush go up and say that God told him to invade Iraq, and then we go ahead and kill 500,000 people in that country, we've single-handedly accounted for more deaths right there than every case of Islamic, terrorist extremism for decades ahead and behind combined. But we did it all sort of through the legitimacy of a state apparatus, even though it was fundamentally motivated by a reflection of the same basic beliefs. The Christian nationalism, the far-right extremism, the ethno-supremacy, all the basic intents were there. It was just we did it through a state, and they didn't have the money to.
Yeah, as I already said, I think that, when you decide to go and invade a country, attack a country, bomb a country, whatever a country, you're creating the conditions under which you create more terrorism, not less. I have no problem. I've been consistent on that since day one. I remember, I was true story. I was in Windsor, right across the river from Detroit, in March of 2003. I was giving a presentation to American and Canadian law enforcement. And I said point blank, because this was, we all knew Iraq was coming, right? We all knew the Bush administration was going to launch an invasion of Iraq because that's where all the signals were pointed. And I got up literally 2 or 3 days before this happened. I said, this is a bad idea, guys. If we, and by we I meant the Americans, because we had already decided under the Croatian government not to participate. If you guys go in, this is going to be a shit show. Not only are you going to kill a lot of people, you're going to make the problem worse. And, obviously 17 years later, we know it became much worse. As I said, Al-Qaeda, which did not have a major presence in Iraq in 2003, developed one, and they morphed eventually into Islamic State. So I don't disagree with you that the actions that we take could certainly be interpreted and construed as state-sponsored terrorism, because the thing with terrorism is it is in the eye of the beholder. And I'll go back to a famous argument that Ronald Reagan made in the middle 1980s, right, about terrorists and freedom fighters. I was in Nicaragua in 1986. It was a church I belonged to. We were doing some humanitarian work in Nicaragua, and I saw the effects of the Contras, what Contras were doing to Nicaraguan communities. And they were supposedly anti-communist freedom fighters fighting those sons of bitches of Sandinistas who were communists, who had overthrown a brutal dictator, Anastasio Somoza. It's all about perspective. So I certainly don't have a problem accepting that what you choose to call terrorism is extremely subjective. And this is part of the problem of trying to come up with a common definition and appreciation for what the term means. I don't know if I'd go as far as to say what the Bush administration's invasion was what I called state-sponsored terrorism. I would call it state-sponsored idiocy. I would call it state-sponsored violence. I would call it obviously an invasion of a sovereign country with no real reason to do so. And we're in the situation we are today because of that.
Gotcha. Do you believe that the term, you just said that terrorism is in the eye of the beholder, and I agree completely. It's the attack on civilians for political purpose, and if you're like an Iraqi child in 2003, you're not going to look up and see drones flying overhead and think, well, at least they're doing it flying a nation's flag, So obviously, the semantic difference between what constitutes a terrorist attack and what constitutes like state-sanctioned terror and what's just an act of war, it gets very fuzzy, and it feels like it's only really relevant from a distance. When up close, the outcomes feel very similar. Do you think the term terrorism is useful sociopolitically at describing a particular type of behavior, or do you feel it is frequently coded to refer only to some groups to deliberately delegitimize their violence, but not as much to other groups, to sort of preserve a veneer of legitimacy to their violence?
Damn, another tough question. The bottom line is that there is no consensus of what terrorism means. So a colleague of mine who's named Alex Schmidt, he and I are both associated with the International Center for Counterterrorism in The Hague. He wrote a paper years ago in which he combed the world's legal codes and academic work, et cetera, to come up with a definition of terrorism. And I believe he stopped counting at 200. So there are 200 definitions of terrorism. Even my own country, Canada, does not define terrorism in our criminal code. We define terrorist activity, not terrorism. And I think that's because we just couldn't come up with an easy definition. I think the term has become highly problematic. Certainly, people are called terrorists for all kinds of reasons. You've already alluded to them. And if you're a young Iraqi child, do you really care whether your family was just killed by ISIS or an American drone? No, you don't. And you're going to probably want to seek revenge or some kind of justice or whatever down the road for the fact that someone violently took your family away from you. The niceties of whether it was terrorist or freedom fighter or whatever, you don't care kind of thing. We are well beyond the point, although I fear, where we can stop talking about terrorism. Let's face it, and I use this term a lot, we live in a post 9/11 world. If 9/11 had not occurred, I feel very strongly a couple of things. One, we wouldn't have 100,000 terrorism experts because no one would give a shit about it. It would be a niche thing for academics. Prior to 9/11, 10 people cared about terrorism in academia. Now there are tens of thousands. Secondly, is that the public wouldn't be so both enthralled by it as well as deathly afraid of it, because we hear about terrorism on a daily basis. One thing I do in my so-called retirement is I just monitor the world's news and I tweet out about terrorist attacks. And I can assure you on any given day, I'm tweeting between 5 and 10 attacks a day somewhere in the world. I'm not saying this is all a product of 9/11, it's not, but the way we look at terrorism has been informed on what happened on that September day in 2001. That's just the era we live in. The same way you could talk about, the post-World War II era or the post-Cold War era. I was part of that too when I worked in intelligence, very different time. So we can't stop talking about terrorism because it's just too ubiquitous. It's just too much around us. And too many people are looking at it, tweeting about it like me and writing books about it and articles, et cetera, et cetera. I think what we have to start doing, though, is start to ask ourselves, what do we really mean by it? And to me, the definition that we use here in Canada for what is an act of terrorism is it is a serious act of violence. So it has to be violent in nature. And it has to be something that's planned and or carried out for political, religious, or ideological reasons. That's what the Canadian Criminal Code says in section 83.01. Now, that is already problematic. What does political mean? You would argue that the Bush administration decision to invade Iraq was political, and it was serious violence, ergo it was terrorism. I don't see this as a solution to our problem, but I do think we have to start looking at what it is we really mean by labeling one person a terrorist and another person not. And I didn't fall off the turnip truck yesterday. I have no illusions. You and I are going to resolve this today or anytime soon. But at least we have to start having the conversation, because the way that we're looking at it now is unhelpful at a minimum, and you could argue is exacerbating the problem at the other end.
Gotcha. Fantastic. Thank you very much. I have one more question on this topic, and then I'd like to move a segue, if I would, to left-leaning groups. So with regards to Islamic terrorism, do you feel that, in a sense, the Western world, particularly America, took the bait? One of the described intentions of Islamic terrorists at the beginning of the 21st century was to exacerbate racial and ethnic tensions between Muslims, Arabs, that group, generally, broadly, and people in the West. And in doing so, the mistreatment that those groups would experience in those countries would drive them to radicalization. Do you feel we kind of took the bait there, that we ended up doing for them what they wanted?
Absolutely. I think that when the Americans, when the Bush administration decided to go into Iraq in March 2003, I'm guessing bin Laden did a little dance. I don't know if bin Laden danced, because he probably saw it was haram, because dancing is fun, and these guys don't believe in fun. But I imagine bin Laden just about shit himself with joy, because he said, here I am sitting in a cave somewhere in Afghanistan. I've got bunker buster bombs. I've got all kinds of people on the ground trying to find me. And now you've turned your attention to the country a couple doors over, and you're going to beat them up instead. And basically what that did is that they took the foot off the gas in terms of the Afghan program. There's no question about that. And you're right. I think Islamist extremist groups state quite boldly that they're trying to goad us into attacking, invading, etc., because they know that in any given attack or plan or anti-terrorism drone strike or cruise missile strike or whatever, they're going to be terrorist casualties. And personally, I have no problem with that. A dead terrorist is a good terrorist as far as I'm concerned. But they're also going to be civilian casualties. And if you look at some of the information coming out of Afghanistan in terms of numbers of civilian casualties over the past 20 years, yeah, a lot of them were at the hands of the Taliban, a terrorist group, and they killed them on purpose because the Taliban are a bunch of jerks. But a certain percentage were also carried out by the West, NATO, etc., that had a mission in Afghanistan. Every civilian casualty is one more reason why terrorist groups say, look, we're not the bad guys. They're the bad guys. They're the ones launching drones and killing your son and your daughter and your mother and your father. We're here to protect you, which is, of course, complete bullshit because all they want to do is impose their antediluvian, centuries-old misinterpretation of Islam on everybody else. But they can use that basically as a recruitment tool. And we drank the Kool-Aid. There's absolutely no question in my mind that by doing that, we took our eye off the ball, which is probably why bin Laden lasted for almost 10 years after 9/11. And we created a problem where there wasn't one before.
Okay, yeah, I'm really happy to hear we agree on that. To move, I guess, a world over, I was curious about some earlier comments that you had made about left-wing terrorism. Now, I don't deny that it exists, of course, and eco-terrorism is probably only going to be more of a problem. Well, I guess problem is a matter of perspective there. It's going to be more frequently occurring as climate change ramps up. But speaking as, I mean, I guess I can speak to this. I've worked previously with Antifa groups while I was in college. Back then, because it was a bit of a quieter time, it mostly just meant hoarding food and distributing it to the poor, because most of what Antifa does is mutual aid. But my experiences with those groups were generally positive. And I was wondering what you thought about President Trump's stated interest in declaring Antifa a terrorist group.
Okay, full disclosure, I am not a specialist at Antifa. I probably know more than the average person because I read a lot. But to my mind, that would be a very hard thing to do because from what I understand, Antifa is not an organization per se. So again, I'll give you the Canadian example. We have a list of terrorist entities. It's on the Public Safety Canada website. And you can say that, Group A, the Brothers for, the Brothers for Grey Paint is now a terrorist group. And you list them, which means that if you're a member, you could be charged. If you raise money for them, you could be charged, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with Antifa, to the best of my knowledge, is it's not a group in the same way that the Three Percenters is a group, or Al-Qaeda is a group, or the Black Bloc is a group. And therefore, for the president to say he wants to list them, it's like nailing Jell-O to the wall. What do you list? Whom do you list? How do you list it? And this is why I think there was a lot of criticism when he said that. Not so much that people didn't think that there were elements in Antifa that were problematic. And let's face it, there are violent elements to Antifa. And given what Antifa stands for, you just told me partly what Antifa stands for. If they were to carry out acts of violence, those would be acts of violence committed in part for ideological reasons, which by my country's definition constitutes terrorism. The problem is that Antifa doesn't exist in the same way that ISIS exists. So I don't know how you would list them. And that would be problematic for your country. Certainly my country hasn't done that. And one could also argue, listing terrorist groups, so what? What does it mean? I can't think of a single trial or list of charges in Canada, and maybe I've missed a few, whereby someone has been arrested and charged because they belong to Group X or Group Y or Group Z. Belonging to it doesn't seem to be enough. You have to actually have been engaged in attack planning or whatever, terrorist financing to be pulled into court. So at the end of the day, I'm not sure what the whole purpose of the exercise is.
Gotcha. Yeah, in my experience, and of course it's been a little while, I remember Black Bloc is a protesting tactic, more so than it is like a subgroup of Antifa when you show up in given clothes or when you act in a certain way. But the thing is, and I completely agree with you with what you said there, because with regards to Antifa, everyone knows what Antifa looks like. They wear the black and they have the flag, and they show up at these protests. But the thing is, there's no registry. Anyone can show up in black and hang out there. And there are people there who are with the same groups who don't show up in black. So it seems like the natural consequence of trying to make this a terrorist group is that we're just giving police sort of carte blanche permission to attack or to arrest anyone who protests against any existing far right group, regardless of what they do or how they dress, you know, which is really, really scary. And it feels like we're, here in America at least, moving to a point where these far right protests, maybe even these far right terrorist groups that you've described, are being legitimized through our law.
Well, and look, your country has very, very strong First Amendment rights. We don't have that. Most of the rest of the world does not have as strong a set of rights for individuals as your country does. And it seems to me that, you know, Americans put up with a hell of a lot of things that in other countries would constitute hate crimes. Now, that's your history, and that's fine. But it seems to be that, I agree with you what you're saying, you can't arrest somebody just because they're there. To me, first of all, it's a waste of resources. Why the hell would you ask your law enforcement to round up a whole bunch of people who are demonstrating, perhaps demonstrating very vociferously and yelling all kinds of nasty things, but are not actually engaged in acts of violence or the planning of acts of violence? That's where you want the resources to be focused. You don't want people blowing shit up. You don't want people killing people. But for people to be yelling at, epithets or swearing at people across the line, that's not an offense in your country, and it's not an offense in most countries. To me, that's a complete misconstrual of what it is we're trying to do here. And so I think on that front, we absolutely agree. Again, the violent elements need to be addressed, and I would imagine that groups like Antifa or Black Bloc or whatever, Black Lives Matter, would themselves want the violent elements to be sidelined because A, it gives them a bad name, B, it convinces some people that the entire movement has been infiltrated by violent people, and therefore that the entire movement has now become violent. That's the last thing you want if you think you have a legitimate cause, legitimate message to spread. You don't want the attention of law enforcement, security, intelligence, because you're not the problem. It's the tiny minority that either take advantage of you, who believe in what you believe in, but are convinced that they can only get their way violently, or, and as we've seen in the United States, especially people from far right groups that infiltrate far left groups and carry out acts of violence, acting as if they're part of the far left to get the attention of law enforcement and security intelligence.
Yeah, I largely agree with you. A linguist and philosopher named Noam Chomsky once said that in America, Antifa is a gift to the right. And at times I'm inclined to believe him. That the way they pursue their tactics makes it very easy for the media to equivocate them and their actions with the actions of the far-right groups they're fighting. Even if, at least from my perspective, the actions and beliefs of Antifa are largely justifiable, certainly when paired up against those of the neo-Nazis they'll often protest against. I would like to see, what would be ideal for me, is that whatever we consider Antifa is literally just citizens' actions groups. They don't wear black. They don't have the flags. They show up. It's moms and dads with their little fanny packs, and they just look like good old-fashioned Americans. And they show up and they shout at Nazis. And I think that'd make it a lot harder for the media to portray it as a fight between two extremist groups, you know?
Yeah, see, I think you raise a good point. To me, if Antifa truly believes for social change and for the reparation of historical wrongs, then they should do everything in their power to be seen as a force for good, and maybe not dress a certain way, maybe not act a certain way. You're always going to have elements who become frustrated at the slow pace of change. So I just put out a podcast this morning looking at eco-terrorism. There was an article on The Economist that talked about a potential future scenario where eco-terrorism became much more serious. And why did it become serious? Because people thought, you know what? No one's listening. We're telling you the planet's changing. We're telling you the climate is warming. We're telling you we're going to hell in a handbasket, and nobody cares. Maybe if I start blowing shit up, you'll start caring. And I think that's what happens sometimes with groups, is that they get to the point where they're shouting themselves hoarse, and they're convinced that no one's listening. And that maybe they'll listen a little bit more if people start dying or buildings start going up in flames. Now, I'm not saying that to excuse what they're doing. To me, it's still terrorism and has to be punished as such. Mm-hmm. But I understand why they get to that point, because they're convinced that we are going down a very, very dangerous pathway, and no one seems to be making any move to alter that pathway and to get us into a safer area. Ergo, they turn to violence.
Yeah, I was going to talk about riots, because in a way, I mean, riots aren't, like you said, the definitions vary. Riots are a little similar to terrorism. Usually, you know, you have a dispossessed population who engage in acts of well, lefties tend to refer to violence as action against living things and property damage distinctly something separate. But riots, you know, generally emerge under at least similar conditions. And I was wondering, how do you feel about the media response to the outburst of rioting and arson that took place, at least in the first couple of days following the death of George Floyd?
Yeah. Well, again, speaking as somebody who used to work in security intelligence and who was basically sworn to uphold the law as it stands, the law, good, bad, or indifferent. I hear I'm quoting Inspector Javert from Les Miserables, the great role played by Charles Laughton in the 1930, whatever it is, film. The law is what it is, and I have to uphold it. There is a part of the criminal code under Section 83.01 in Canada, which does talk about infrastructure damage in the pursuit of an ideological or a political end actually constitutes a terrorist act. Now, when you're talking riots, that's something I think a little bit different. Now, I'm not an expert on crowds. I'm not an expert on how crowds move in a certain direction or how crowds change their activity in a relatively rapid period of time as things are developing. There's no question to me that peaceful protest can turn violent for a number of reasons. One, there are violent people who happen to be part of the movement that is demonstrating. They may be reacting to what they perceive as indifference. They may be reacting to what they perceive as violence on the other side, i.e. law enforcement trying to push them back, or, you know, the truncheons come out or whatever kind of thing. So I think we have to be careful in trying to determine, was there ever truly an ideological or political intent to use violence, whether it's against infrastructure or individuals, or was this some kind of a spontaneous reaction to an ever-changing event? That's really tough to do, right? You can't stop the clock and say, okay, time out here, let's analyze this situation, because it's a fluid, moving kind of thing. You can do so in hindsight. So it seems to me that when you're talking about riots, like in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder, that's a real tough one. I would guess that it's probably all of the above. There probably were individuals using the cover of legitimate protests, in other words, who had every intent of using violence right from the get-go. There are probably those who resorted to violence because of frustration or reaction to violence visited upon them. And there's probably other categories that I'm simply not thinking about off the top of my head. As I said earlier, all this stuff is extremely complicated, and I really get very concerned when people say there's an easy solution to it.
No, of course. I don't have answers to any of these questions. The circles that I run in online have a very particular approach towards addressing these issues. I was very interested, and still am very interested, in your perspective. I doubt anyone could answer these, but the perspective is still worthwhile. I guess I have a few more questions. This time has flown by, which is crazy. But I really, really want to know, do you believe in such a thing as justified terrorism? And we can use the most hyperbolic examples imaginable, like eco-terrorist in the third world destroying an oil rig and it frees up a river that lets the villages fish again, or something like that. Do you believe it is at any point justifiable to take such extreme actions for a better good, or do you think that that's never a justifiable venue for activism?
Oh, wow.
Not that you have to condone anything or anything.
No. Okay. Let me try to answer this in a different way. I'm not sure this is a satisfactory answer, but I'm sure you're familiar with Augustinian and just war theory in the Christian church, right? War is bad. War kills all kinds of people, all kinds of damage. Usually lasts, the effects last for decades. Wars often spur other wars, and yet there is a doctrine in the Christian church, well, the Catholic church, because when Augustine was around, there's only Catholics around, that under certain circumstances, violence, which is abhorrent to the Christian faith, Christians are supposed to turn the other cheek, blah, blah, blah. We all know what teachings of Jesus had to say about that. There are certain conditions under which violence is okay or even required, which is what my understanding of just war theory. And trust me, I'm not a theologian. I haven't studied this at the yin yang. But if you think of it that way, you might go to the nth degree and say, well, if that's true, and we accept that there are reasons for just war. So, for example, the decision to go up against Nazi Germany in 1939 was a just war. If we had not done that, he would have kept invading countries. He would have kept enslaving and killing millions of people, and therefore we had no choice but to go to war against Germany and its allies in 1939. So if you use that same logic for terrorism, then you would say, well, I'll take your hypothetical example of the oil refinery that's stopping a river or damaging a fishing ground or whatever it is you want to use. The presence of this particular facility will continue to cost lives, either through malnutrition or starvation or lack of livelihood or whatever. The elimination of this facility will make things better and to try to make the lives of the locals, make it easier for them. Ergo, I can therefore justify the elimination of this facility under any means possible. I could first of all I can negotiate that they shut down. And if they don't do so, then we can maybe protest to put pressure on the government to shut them down. And if that doesn't work, then maybe we have to take the law into our own hands. I understand that argument, but what I would simply end with is that when you start going down the pathway where individuals or individual groups decide on their own merits based on their own calculations that their cause is such that the law does not apply to them, where does this end? I hate slippery slope arguments. I think slippery slope arguments are lazy, to be perfectly honest, because people will invent all kinds of bullshit. Well, if this happens and then blah, blah, blah. I don't like that. But still, I think it does open the door to people saying, well, if they can do that, well, then I guess I can do that. I would think that, if this is an ideal world, and of course it is not and never will be, we would find ideal solutions to deal with this. So in the lack of an ideal world with ideal solutions, is it ever okay? Is it ever condonable to use a serious act of violence to get your way, even if the greater good comes out of that act of violence? I can't wait. I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's a really great one. And I think if we could resolve it, we'd be a lot better off. But I think it's one we look at, because there's no question that for most people, certain things like the Nazi rise to power in the 1930s and the invasion of Poland, et cetera, did mean we could essentially break the law and go to war with another country. Extreme circumstances sometimes require extreme actions. Who gets to decide those? Who gets to rule on them? A much wiser person than me would have to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, even if you're just like watching movies or consuming media errantly, it's pretty easy to find examples, especially in fiction, where sometimes every available circumstance justifies committing an act which is unquestionably illegal. And even after doing so, you recognize, even though that was justified, it is equally justified for the law to continue to take its mark. I don't know if there are any easy answers for this, and I don't think that we're going to see a justified terrorism clause in our international law anytime in the near future. But yeah, I appreciate your appreciation of the nuance on that. Actually, I can't believe it's been nearly an hour. There's one more question that I'd really like to ask you, and it's a little bit of a vague one, but I hope you'll humor me. Are you at all afraid for the future?
Yes and no. Let me start with no. I am a very rapidly approaching 60-year-old Canadian who spent 32 years in security intelligence. Therefore, I'm a retired civil servant, and I'm sure it's the same in your country. I am on a very good pension, thanks to my service to my queen in my country. You guys don't have a queen, we have a queen. And so I'm sitting pretty fat and happy. I've been married to the same woman for over 31 years. I've got 3 grown-up children. I have 2 grandchildren. I have a wonderful cottage just outside of Algonquin Park where I go and I stare at the lake and think, oh my God, I've made it. I'm financially secure. I'm intellectually curious. I'm intellectually engaged. And therefore, life is my life is my apple right now. I don't have any real health concerns. I'm happy. I'm well established, et cetera, et cetera. So from that perspective, no. Having said that, there are a number of things that are obviously should be of concern to anybody who's not brain dead. Climate change being one of them. The current COVID crisis obviously has affected us all in innumerable ways. It's almost hard to remember what it was like before March of this year. In fact, the sort of the first COVID restrictions in Canada happened the day of my wife's birthday, and life has been different since then in terms of who we see, who we don't see, et cetera, et cetera. Violence that's happening around the world is a concern, although I'll come back to that in a second at the end. I want to end positively. I don't want to end on a negative note. I would also say that every era in human history has its challenges, be they societal violence, be they environmental catastrophe, be they poverty, et cetera, et cetera. And ours is no different. I also worked during the Cold War, where we were really concerned about mutually assured destruction, and it never came to that. But there were times when we were worried that it would. I just started working in intelligence when the Soviets shot down a Korean airliner off the Kamchatka Peninsula in 1983, and there were concerns that would escalate into something really serious. It didn't, in hindsight. So I think that every era in human history has these challenges. So yes, they are to be worried about. But let me end. This is where I want to end on the positive note. You're probably aware of a scholar called Steven Pinker. I am, yes. He's actually Canadian. He's born in Montreal. I got to know Steven Pinker, not personally. I was actually, I taught linguistics at university for years, and he's a linguist by profession. He only became a public philosopher, if you want, in the last decade or so. A couple of years ago, he wrote a book you may have heard it called The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he shows, I think definitively, that human society over the past 10,000 years has become incredibly less violent as measured by death rates and all kinds of things. We are the safest we've ever been as a species in our entire history. It's not perfect, but we're a damn sight better than we were even 100 years ago, where, let's face it, and he goes through child abuse, he goes through, wife abuse, he goes through all kinds of things. All these problems still exist, but they existed on orders of magnitude larger in the past than they have today. What that tells me is that maybe we're finally waking up as humans and doing things a little better. We're still going to deal with climate change, which unfortunately your president doesn't seem to think exists. At least we do here in Canada. And there are other problems we're going to have to face, but I am cautiously optimistic that we're finally getting it and that we're willing to work a little more together to resolve things. The past few years have been bad, partly because the man in charge in the White House, also what's happening in Hungary and Brazil, Boris Johnson, United Kingdom, Putin. China is a shit show that I don't know what we're going to do with China. But I think that overall, if you look at the world through Pinker's lens, I think you have to admit that we're actually doing better than expected at this point in our human history. And that gives me cause for optimism. But as somebody who still looks at terrorism on a daily basis, I am still dismayed at the frequency with which terrorism occurs on this planet, still on a daily basis. So I'm not sure if that's a good answer or not, but I'm a glass half full kind of guy. I always have been. I'm an optimist. So I'd like to end this on an optimistic note.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I appreciate you coming on, actually. I found you significantly easier to talk to than I thought I would.
What were you expecting?
Oh, generally speaking, in the leftist community, there is, I'll say, a pre-existing bias against people associated with state intelligence apparatuses.
That's right.
I can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming on. I really, really do.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I apologize, by the way, for taking so long to respond with the emails. I'm just generally bad at media upkeep.
No worries. Well, listen, I mean, if you've got more questions, why don't we do this again? I'm just an old retired guy. I'll be sitting at the lake answering your questions. So it's all the same to me.
Oh, I've got your Discord now. I'd be happy to.
That's right. Let's plan for a future episode then.
Absolutely. Thank you very, very much for coming on. I hope you have a phenomenal day. I appreciate you ending on a positive note. And at the end, if there's anything at all you'd like to shout out or recognize, then please feel free to do so.
Sure. I'll just say for people who are interested, if they found this podcast interesting, I want to read some more of my views, you can go to my website, which is borealisthreatandrisk.com. So Borealis, as in Northern Lights, borealisthreatandrisk.com.
Thank you very, very much for coming on. I'll post your links in the video description and in chat, of course. And have a wonderful time. I hope that you have a pleasant walk to the lake in the near future.
Thanks very much for having me. It was a real pleasure on my part, too.
Be well.
You too.